The fall sitting of Alberta's Legislative Assembly wrapped up this week, the government passing 13 bills. That includes some controversial legislation that limits the rights of minors to access gender-affirming care. Now, for more on what was accomplished over the past few months, Provincial Affairs reporter Michelle Bellefontaine joins us now. Thanks so much for being here, Michelle.
You're welcome.
So a lot happened over the past few months. Let's start with some of the big highlights of the session.
Okay, well, the measures passed in the bills include changes to provincial access to information, which critics say will further limit what the government will release to applicants. There was legislation that deals with the upcoming Electoral Boundaries Commission. It adds 2 more seats for the next election, but it also removes the requirement that constituencies have to follow municipal boundaries. Now, critics are saying that this could create ridings that have urban as well as rural components, which critics say could give the UCP an advantage in the next election. Another bill allows the construction of all-season resorts on public lands. Now, this is something that environmental groups in the opposition are alarmed about because it doesn't subject these proposals to the usual environmental impact assessments. There were amendments to the Alberta Bill of Rights, which includes the right to medical autonomy, so not forcing people to get vaccines if they don't want them, for example. And then there's the 3 controversial bills dealing with transgender youth and adults that really got the most attention. And I'll talk about those in a second. Now, for the opposition, NDP, they say the overall number of bills and all the bills in this session dealt with things that they felt were important to the UCP membership, but not to average Albertans who are concerned about affordability, housing, and health care.
All right, so going back to what you were saying, you were alluding to, of course, that transgender legislation. Tell us a little bit more about what made it so controversial.
Well, advocates for transgender people in the opposition say the bills will hurt the ability of children to get gender-affirming care, even if their parents agree to it, and also forcibly out kids to their parents before they're ready. Now, critics are saying the suite of changes contained in 3 separate bills make Alberta's legislation the worst in the country for transgender people. So as of Thursday, when these 3 bills received royal assent, surgeons in Alberta will no longer be able to perform gender-affirming surgeries on minors under 18. Physicians will no longer be able to prescribe puberty blockers and other hormone types of therapy for children under 15 unless the treatment is underway. Now, this particular piece of it is going to come into effect sometime this winter when the new guidelines come in. And the legislation also forces teachers to get parental permission. Say if a child under 15 comes to them and says, listen, I want to use a different name or pronoun at school. Now, parental permission isn't needed for 16 and 17-year-olds that make this disclosure, but parents still need to be told. The other change is that transgender athletes will no longer be able to compete on male and female sports teams. The province says that these sports leagues can set up a co-ed division to give these athletes a place to compete. Now, those particular changes are expected to come into effect in fall of 2025. The changes to these bills were passed by the UCP majority in the House. The opposition NDP proposed several amendments, including one that would give kids who tell a teacher they want to change their pronouns and names at school a chance to walk it back after they learn that, once they tell the teacher, their parents would have to be informed. But government MLAs voted that particular measure down.
Okay, so you mentioned the opposition.
Yes.
And of course, they have a new leader this time around. So what was different about their strategy this session?
Well, this was the first, as you mentioned, the first legislative assembly with Naheed Nenshi as the NDP leader. Now, so there's a couple of things. Nenshi doesn't have a seat. So in the legislature, Christina Gray, an NDP MLA from Edmonton, she was taking on the opposition leader duties in the House. But, as you mentioned, there's been a big change in how the NDP does things. So, for example, they don't do daily news conferences like they used to do. And they also don't spend hours and hours in the legislature introducing a whole bunch of amendments. And this was really notable, particularly with these 3 bills that dealt with transgender Albertans. So we asked Nenshi about that after the session closed, and he explained why they followed that strategy.
We were told very clearly by the trans community that this has been, not just the trans community, but by people across Alberta, that this has been going on since January 31st. And really vulnerable children have felt like they've been in the crosshairs the entire time. So at the end of the day, the government was going to pass this legislation. And for us to drag these kids through more and more and more and stretch it out, it wasn't humane, it wasn't right.
Now, the constitutionality of these 3 bills will be challenged in court. 2 organizations, EGAL and Skipping Stone, have already said they plan to do that. Now, the NDP introduced some amendments to these transgender bills, but they were voted down. So Nenshi says the NDP is now leaving this to the courts for them to decide.
Okay, so we've heard from the NDP.
Yeah.
How is the government viewing this session?
Well, the government, was really pleased with what they were able to achieve in this very shortened fall session. House Leader Joseph Scow thinks his particular bill, the Fairness and Safety in Sport Act, makes Alberta a leader in Canada for protecting women and girls in sports. And Scow thinks the tone of the legislature was much better this sitting than it has been in the past. Now, for the NDP's part, Nenshi said that he had instructed his MLAs not to heckle or yell back at UCP MLAs, leaving the MLAs on the government side to do all the heckling. Now, the UCP MLAs made frequent digs at Nenshi as NDP leader, chiding him for not immediately seeking a seat in the House. And even at the news conference, Scow dove right into that particular type of criticism.
It's been, I think, 166 days since he became leader of the NDP. And while our leader, Danielle Smith, comes to work every day and leads our members in the chamber and stays there for the entire question period, shows up for votes, their leader is somewhere in the building, or maybe not in the building, acting like an armchair quarterback, throwing shots at our government when he's chosen not to even show up for work. So I'll leave that in his hands as to when he decides to join us and when one of their members decides to resign and open a seat for him.
Now, Alicia, despite what Joseph Scow is suggesting there, I mean, Nenshi was in the building. He was in the legislature. Sometimes he would be up at the, in the public gallery watching. Other times he'd be in the NDP's caucus office on maybe one floor below the actual chamber, watching it on TV. But he did come to speak to legislature reporters like myself every day before question period in the same hallway that MLAs use to go into the chamber. But of course, the fact that Nenshi decided not to run in the Lethbridge West by-election on December 18th is what's behind this criticism. Now, we're done. We're done for this year. The House is now adjourned until the end of February. And then that's when the government intends to introduce the provincial budget, and we're hearing us on February 27th.
And I'm sure it's probably going to be another jam-packed session once we're back.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
All right, Michelle, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.